Hello everybody, Darren Cross here. Welcome to MBA 661 Module 1. And in this course, we're going to begin to delve into the concepts of leadership and strategy. This module, the reading materials required for this module are the E-Myth chapters 1 and 2, and the two articles, I think it's What Makes a Leader and What Leaders Really Do. So we're going to talk about some of those things here. The first thing that I want you to really ground yourself in is the concept of strategy in the first place, because I'm not sure that a lot of people really understand what strategy is. Whenever I ask students what strategy really means, or what strategy is, or why we even have a need for strategy, what I often get is that strategy is a plan. Strategy is planning out what we're supposed to do. Strategy is a goal. Strategy is taking action. And all of those things are components of strategy, but my question is, why do we need strategy? Why can't we just do things? Why do we have to have another word for all of this stuff that we're talking about? And so when we think about why we actually need strategy, the reason why is because in business, what we are doing is competing with other companies, and so the purpose of strategy is to basically develop a set of actions so that you can win. And that's really what it's about. So strategy is about winning. Strategy requires competition. Otherwise, it's logistics, right? If your goal is to simply get something completed, then we're talking about the logistics of doing that. But when we're talking about strategy, this is this broad level, aggregate and abstract way of thinking so that you can create activities to beat the competition. That's what strategy is about. Strategy comes from the Greek word strategos, which is really, it's a military word, and generals use this concept in order to beat other people. And so that's really what strategy is about. So if you look at that article that's posted in Module 1, it's from Michael Porter. And in the world of strategy, Michael Porter is the man. He wrote a majority of the things that are the seminal concepts in the world of strategy, and so you're going to be hearing and seeing his name a lot over the course of the next 8 weeks. So in that article, it talks about this concept of organizational effectiveness. Now, as you guys are managers inside of your organizations and you go to work every day, organizational effectiveness is something that's being pushed all the time. And in fact, there are several measures of organizational effectiveness, and some are pretty universal measures that all companies are concerned about, but others are specific to the key success factors and indicators that exist inside of your company or in your industry. But in general, one of the things that we tend to focus on is the concept of organizational effectiveness. And so, are we able to get done what we say we're going to get done? These things that we say we want to do, how great we are at actually accomplishing these things. That in and of itself is not strategy, though. It's very, very important, and I don't want to give you the impression that that strategy takes the place of organizational effectiveness. That's not really what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, while organizational effectiveness is important, it's less valuable when those things that you say you want to get done are not tied to some kind of way of winning. And so, I always talk about you could be great and effective, but if you have the ladder on the wrong wall, you're climbing it and you're making progress, but you get to the top and you realize this is the wrong wall to begin with. And so strategy is really about understanding what even leads to organizational effectiveness. And so what we'll talk about along the way is this concept of setting yourself apart, being willing or able to do things that other companies are not willing or able to do. And when we're talking about strategy, that's essentially what it's about. So let's now take that and let's delve into the E-Myth. So in chapters 1 or 2, we talk about the E-Myth, and the first thing that we discuss in the E-Myth is really what the E-Myth is. And I think that many people have really kind of been in this position before, but just listen to how I lay this out and tell me if it makes sense. So the E-Myth in general is this myth that because people are good at a thing or a technical skill, that they should go into business doing that thing or that technical skill because they would be great at the business of that. So, Grandma makes great cupcakes, and you say, Grandma, these cupcakes are amazing. You should totally start a business. Everyone will buy these cupcakes. And so she's excited. She's like, you think so? And, you go into all of this stuff of making the cupcakes, and she is. She's great. These cupcakes are the #1 cupcakes in the world. Then Grandma goes into business and quickly realizes that the product is one small piece of this, and that it's rare that the product can be so great that you can ignore all of the other skills that are necessary in order to run an effective business. And so the E-myth essentially is that we think that because Grandma's great at making cupcakes, she would be good at the business of making and selling cupcakes. And that's just not true. It doesn't mean, so I want to make this distinction because every class we talk about this, and someone says something like, the E-myth is that if you're good at a technical skill, you're going to be bad at business. No, what I'm saying is, if you're good at a technical skill, it does not necessarily translate to the truth that you would be good at the business of that technical skill. The truth of the matter is, there are other things that you have to be good at in order to actually create and maintain a business. And we're going to talk about this as we go along. In Chapter 2 of the E-myth, we go into the people who are actually involved in business. So the Chapter 2 of the E-myth talks about the fact that there is the technician. The technician is the person who actually is doing the technical work. So in this cupcake scenario, the technician is the person who's creating the cupcakes. You have the entrepreneur on the other end, and the entrepreneur is the visionary who actually provides all of the resources, including the vision for this business of creating the cupcakes. And then there's the manager in the middle, the intermediary, whose job it is to translate this vision into organizational effectiveness that's going to amount to a winning strategy. The problem is, in the beginning, all three of these people tend to be the same person. And so when people are starting that business, they are kind of confused about what role to play. Now, as we go through this book and we're thinking about corporate strategy, I want you to think very, very, or less aggregately than what we might think corporate strategy is. All of these things will translate to corporate strategy, but I want to keep it in the small pond so that the concepts make sense to you. And then over the course of doing the assessments that we have to do, you'll realize how to translate small business strategy into corporate strategy. So the problem with all of these three people, again, is that they in the beginning they are the same person, and so you have to kind of journey from being this technician to being the entrepreneur. Now, as we go along, what I want you to notice is that there are multiple journeys that are kind of happening at the same time, and those are the things that I think will become apparent to you. First of all, there's this journey of going from entrepreneur, or going from technician to an entrepreneur. At the same time, we are journeying from where we are into being a great leader, and that's where the HBR articles come in, and we'll talk about those here in a second. And then the third journey is, we'll talk about it a little bit more in depth in the next module, but the next journey is the journey from this idea or concept to being an actual mature business. And you're going to see that what that business really means is very specific, and a lot of people think that they're in business, but they're actually not. They're self-employed, and there's some elements that have to exist there, and once we kind of understand that, then we'll understand why these principles are so very important. So now that we understand kind of what strategy is, what the E-myth concept is about, let's begin to talk about this journey of leadership. And so the first article for this module is an article by Daniel Goleman that talks about emotional intelligence. If you have studied business, you have heard about emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence in a nutshell, is basically our ability to understand our emotional selves and to control and regulate our emotional selves, interacting with our ability to also understand the emotions of others and to interact with them in a socially appropriate way to the extent that we can accomplish the goals that we have. So I really, when I started studying this material a while back, what this amounted to me to is these people were just people who kind of just get it, right? So people are made up of all kinds of things, but emotions are one of them, right? So some people are really logical, some people are emotional, and the things that kind of inform whether or not we are one of these things, it could be a varied number of things. But the thing to understand is, have you ever met someone and you're talking to them, and as you're talking to them, they're giving you feedback, and you're like, yes, that's what I mean. And afterwards, you're like, I really had a great talk with this person. They really are good people. They kind of understand and they kind of get it. These are people with emotional intelligence. When you understand what's going on inside of you emotionally and you can apply it to others and understand that as well, that is very important to good leadership. And so Goleman in that article talked about some elements, and let's talk about those here in detail. So the first element is self-awareness. So that makes sense. Being aware of how we're actually feeling. First of all, just being aware. Is it appropriate for the situation? Are we aware of the reason for how we feel, what's going on emotionally? A lot of people don't understand that. My wife is a social worker, a clinical social worker, and I talk to her about this kind of thing all the time. And they talk about emotional intelligence and the behavioral sciences as well. And she kind of said, and I want to put this in the right space here, because she said that there are people who kind of go with the flow emotionally, and then there are people who have personality disorders. Now, to put this in the right space, when you hear disorder, it sounds like something is wrong. But what she explained to me is that it sounds to her like emotional intelligence is the opposite of having some kind of a personality disorder. Personality disorder, we all have them. I need you to understand that. It only becomes a problem when it's to the extent that we can't function. But let's talk about this. Have you ever talked to a person who you're talking to them and you get the sense that they are not listening to you at all? All that they are doing is just listening, like they're waiting for their break so that they can start talking about their stuff. And their stuff is not related to anything that you said. It's a jointed conversation. And it's maybe an idiosyncrasy. I want to make sure that I put this in the right spot here. So there are people I know that no matter what happens, the conversation always leads to the same thing. Or when someone is perhaps, you see this in leadership where someone's deal is, I am the leader, and so I'm going to rule with an iron fist, and they come in and they yell at everyone. That is not a person with emotional intelligence. They don't understand necessarily what's going on with them emotionally, and so they don't understand that this emotion that they have is now displaying to other people. And so these other elements come into play and kind of show why that's kind of an important thing, especially if you're going to be a leader. So self-awareness is number one. Number two, self-regulation. If you're super pissed off about something, it is not always appropriate. If you're a leader, if you're a person, but especially if you're a leader, you really need to think about an appropriate way to respond considering what your emotions are, right? You can't just fly off the handle every time because you're mad. You can't say, I'm mad, so I'm going to rage against everyone. So, good leaders have a great ability to regulate their own emotions. Motivation. So Goleman says that good leaders with high emotional intelligence actually they are self-motivated. So they, just for the sake of achievement, they actually have this internal drive to just get things done. And as we go along, you're going to see how that becomes important. All of these articles that we were talking about over the course of the next 8 weeks are really, what is this author's perspective on what good leadership really is. And so you'll see this theme repeat itself. Number 4, empathy. This is where we start to look at other people. So we begin to understand the emotions of other people and we can empathize. See, when we're interacting, a lot of times we're trying to get our point across, but we are, have you ever heard someone say it's falling on deaf ears? It's because this person is in an emotional space where they can't actually respond to you or maybe even have a productive conversation. And if you have low emotional intelligence, if you're not aware of their emotions and you're just trying to respond to get your point across, then what's happening is you're not being productive at all. And so when you have high emotional intelligence, you have this ability to step back and say, okay, I empathize with them. I'm seeing where they're coming from. This is very crucial because it leads to the next thing, which is social skill. So quite often, especially when you're a leader and you're trying to get people to want to do this thing that you're trying to get them to do, the way that you interact with them is very, very important. And so if you don't understand what's going on with them emotionally, there's a good chance that you could interact in a way that actually makes the problem worse, or is at the very least, not productive. And so all of these elements are necessary. But another thing to note is that emotional intelligence research is pretty much conclusive that organizational intelligence leads to great leadership, and also just about every organizational effectiveness measure that's out there. And so that's a very important thing to take into consideration. The other article is What Leaders Really Do by John Cotter. And it's talking about this interaction between managers and leaders. So is a manager necessarily a good leader? Is a leader necessarily a good manager? And so in order to do that, what he does is he actually looks at the POLC, Planning, Organizing, Leading, and Controlling Framework of Management. That's what managers do, right? But what do leaders do? And what he said is that it's more of an aggregate way of doing those things. And again, I don't want you to hear that we want to do away with planning, organizing, leading, and controlling. All I'm saying is that the distinction of good leaders is that they do a more aggregate and visionary version of planning, organizing, leading, and controlling. And so the author actually kind of parallels things, and he says that where managers plan, excuse me, leaders set the vision and actually set the direction for the organization. So managers are planning. What resources do we have? What are we actually trying to do? What is the timeline necessary? This is not what a leader is thinking about. Now, right here I want to interject this concept of technician versus entrepreneur, right? Technician is concerned about what's happening today. The manager is concerned about getting these things done. And the entrepreneur is concerned about a more aggregate, visionary version of what's going on. And we'll talk about these as we go along too. So you can see that that's a bigger version. Not necessarily better, because you need to think about the resources you have and how to get things done and all of that stuff. But you can see that it's just a more aggregate view. Instead of organizing, leaders align people. So what it's really about is understanding a bigger picture of things and understanding that relationships in this entire organization might be more important than the functionalities, which is what you would think about when you're organizing. We'll talk about that later in a later module. But the idea is that we have to take into consideration those relationships. Now, let me interject organization or emotional intelligence. If now relationships are more and more important, then you can understand that the components of the people who engage in those relationships are also important, right? My emotions, how I'm able to understand and regulate my emotions, how I'm able to empathize with people and interact with them in a productive way. See, all of these things are interwoven. And the last thing is controlling. Instead of controlling, leaders tend to motivate and inspire. Now, this doesn't mean that you don't do away with control, or that you do away with control measures and we don't need them. It's just that managers do that, and a leader just says, hey, if I'm going to lead you and if we're going to do a good job, I shouldn't have to check you because I'm inspiring you, and I know that you're going to do things that serve the vision that we actually have. And so these things kind of interact, but they in no way necessarily replace each other. Sometimes managers are good leaders. Sometimes managers are not good leaders, and they aren't visionary, and they aren't able to inspire and things like that. And then sometimes leaders are not necessarily good managers. They're great at inspiring people, but the things don't actually get done because they lack the details. And so understand all of these things, kind of chew on this stuff a little bit, and then go through all of the assessments in Module 1, and I think that's going to set you up for a great path to complete this course. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Good luck, everyone.